ask how your son is doing, sir?
He's okay, thank you. So we're going to look at the Abolition of Man today, which for some reason I have no copy of in my, I couldn't find my copy in the office among my other trials today. But I know what I'm going to say about it anyway, and I'm going to refer to it explicitly in the lecture. I've put on the whiteboard a number of books that are relevant to the topic. I could actually give you a large bibliography on the subject, because this is an area of extreme interest to me and has been for many years. So I didn't put my own book on here, Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences, although I intended to do it, but I'm confused this morning, so I think I forgot as I was on the way out to grab my own book. But the issues that Lewis raises in the Abolition of Man, I was attuned to while writing my doctoral thesis, and I only read the Abolition of Man at the end of it, and then realized, oh no, Lewis has said everything I wanted to say, and he says it much better. How infuriating. On the other hand, at least if Lewis is saying it, then I'm not as crazy as I think I might be at this point in my thesis, and that's a vaguely comforting thought, I guess. But we're going to look at the Abolition of Man. We're going to reflect on it in conjunction with That Hideous Strength, which was actually written after it, and I think illustrates it quite well. What he's talking about, the sort of modern education of Mark Studdock, and the sociologist, and what Lewis thinks about the conditioners, or a type of education model which he is seeing everywhere around him. And he'll pick up this little book, a little book that he called the Green Book, maybe because it was green, written by two educators. So that the book is actually, scholars have found out, it was The Control of Language, 1939, by two high school educators, Alec King and Martin Ketley, meant for, as I say, the senior grades of British public schools. But he doesn't want to attack those two gentlemen, so he doesn't mention them by name. But he wants to say, I'm not just presenting this as a hypothetical theory of education. This is actually not only, this isn't a radical or a fringe view of education, this is the establishment view of education now in his own day. And so he doesn't mention them by name, and he calls them Gaius and Titius, so fictitious Latin names. But he wants to talk about this theory of education that they present as a modest one, and make an argument that if it is accepted, which it has been even in Lewis's day, and more than 70 years onwards, is now so far established that it is beyond question. He says if it is accepted, then we have what is effectively the Abolition of Man. And the Abolition of Man is the third of the three chapters and the most famous of the three. So I'm going to backtrack in order, but I want to go actually to mention the third chapter, which is the most famous of the three first, and then I'll go back to the first two. Now the first two are Men Without Chests. We'll have to discuss what he means by that. Then there's The Way, which is the second chapter, and that's what he calls the Tao. And then the third chapter is the Abolition of Man. So Men Without Chests is his study or his commentary on this book, this green book. Chapter 2, having illustrated that the effect of this is to cut out the Tao, describes what the Tao is, which is the moral law, for those who are unacquainted with it. And the moral law, well, I mean, you've read the book, or at least I hope you have, and I can't entirely summarize it, is the understanding of the basic human understanding of a moral universe in which we are a part, which is understood not only by Christians but every major religion. That's what he illustrates in the Tao. So this is not a Christian point of view, although Christians will obviously agree to it. You will find the same thing among Islam, amongst Confucians, Taoists, Jews, even North American natives. And there's an appendix in which he cites the passages to support his assertion about it. So that's chapter 2. It's illustrating what is under attack in chapter 1. Chapter 3, the abolition of man, leads us to the consequences of that attack. And that's really what is being illustrated in that hideous strength. And it seems graphic and it seems apocalyptic. Lewis is describing it as an ever-present reality. And even more so. Now, these books that I've described on the board here, Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. Arendt is a German Jewish philosopher, pupil of Martin Heidegger, profoundly influential on my intellectual development. So I put the second chapter of my book was on her and her account of the human condition, because she says that the human condition has changed because of technology. Human nature has not changed because human nature is unchangeable, but the human condition has. And because we are conditioned beings, that is, we don't just have a human nature, but we are the products of human nurture. If our environment changes, then human nature adapts to it, for good or for ill. Western society pre-technology was founded on a hard-fought battle between Christianity and classical culture, and freedom is expanded in that. The understanding of human freedom and the equality of every individual human being under the law, every person bearing the image of God. So there's a certain human worth, irrespective of whether you're young or old or wealthy or poor. That's enhanced in that, and there's the need for freedom, because again, the Western understanding is predicated on the importance of love. It's not just Augustinian theology, it's our whole culture surrounding marriage and the purpose of human life, marriage and the family and so forth. Though all those things are the rich legacy of Christianity, I would say, although also the fruits of classical culture. But modern technology changes that. And it does partly so by delivering terrific new discoveries, so medical discoveries, allowing us to combat diseases, understanding basic sanitation, which probably is the best medical discovery, just cleanliness, and making modern medicine something other than what it was historically, which is, let's try not to kill the patient. That's the first rule of medicine, the Hippocratic Oath. First rule of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. That's right there, first paragraph. By the way, modern renderings of the Hippocratic Oath they take that out. Yeah, it's not there. It has not been for decades. But so the first thing, do not do any harm. So there's a.
It's still not. It's still in sight.
It's the Hippocratic Oath exists. That line does not. First, do no harm. It's not there. You can
it's
look
a
it
rule
up.
in ethics.
It might be a rule in ethics, but it's not the Hippocratic Oath that the doctors would take.
Mm.
Because if it was, then you would have to question whether acting might produce harm, and then it would be a restraint on action. The modern doctor is there to cure you, to address it, not just to say, sorry, I can't do anything about that. And historically, a medical professional, a doctor, would say, there's nothing I can do about this. So if I'm not certain, I'm not going to try and do this. There might be an unintended consequence here. So there's a restraint on the doctor in the Hippocratic Oath.
Mm.
Modern medical professionals make no such thing. They prescribe pills right away for everything. We'll give surgeries, etc. So it's a big change in the whole understanding of modern medicine. That I'll get off topic if I talk too much about that. But that would have been the earliest understanding of what medicine was there to do. Now, the reason why the modern change doesn't seem as harmful to us is largely because the human condition has been bettered by modern science. As say, drinkable water. We don't get sick by drinking water. In Shakespeare's day, you'd rather drink beer and wine because you're less likely to get a disease from drinking that. That's why they drank it, not just because they liked beer and wine. It was better than the water. The water had bacteria in it, made them sick. They didn't have modern sanitation. They didn't know about infection, how infection happened, because they didn't understand microbiology. And so they would it would be attributed to all manner of things, like the too much blood or whatever, like a lack of balance in your metabolism and so forth, or the influence of demons, all which are possible, by the way, but they have no other explanation. They don't understand microbiology, as I say. So modern science has delivered terrific advances that I think somewhat obscure the overreach that is now brought about through science, and Lewis is talking about that. So let me speak about that. So Arendt talks about this here. Jacques Ellul in the Technological Society speaks about modern society as being precisely that, the managed state, where human freedom is ever diminishing, or freedom is understood as the freedom to do what I want, but it's not connected with human nature anymore. The right to choose. Danielson's the Tao of Right and Wrong, I mentioned that last class, is simply a recapitulation of Lewis's thesis, although really he's only talking about the second chapter and the first. He doesn't really come down to quite as critically talk about the abolition of man. I mean, the title is telling. It's a good book, though. I like it. This is a critique of what the effect of all this is. If we don't accept that human nature is something created or given, to which we need to be cautious and reverent and acknowledge that God ultimately is not only the author of our being, but ordains everything for our good, and will be the judge of all human history. If we don't see things that way, then through modern science and the desire for humanitarian intervention, we will effectively become transhumanists. And so he talks about this, the quest for cybernetic immortality. It's a descriptive title. It's pretty good. Written by a man in London, I believe. London, Ontario. Michael Sandel, The Case Against Perfection, is talking about perfection in ethical terms. Makes a case against it. You won't often hear a case against perfection. It's a good one. Not a Christian author. I think probably a secular Jewish author. I think he's a Harvard lecturer. What did I do with it? Oh, it's under there. Never mind. Sadulescu and Pearson talks about moral enhancement. So this is an aspect of transhumanism, is we are going to, just like in Huxley's Brave New World, give people, we're going to intervene so that people don't do bad things before they do them. If you've ever seen Minority Report with Tom Cruise, that movie that's sort of like thought, before a crime happens, you can intervene and stop it from happening. It's not like that. It is, however, recognizing that certain individuals in their circumstances and backgrounds are more likely to commit criminal acts. So therefore, how do we manage their nature to make it so that they don't do such things? And it'll be largely chemical. Widely popular, by the way, already. If you've got ADHD, then you're being given chemicals to manage your behavior. But and that's a sort of a moral enhancement, by the way. So if you can't sit still and behave in class, then we'll give you a chemical that'll stop that. That's a sort of moral enhancement. You probably never thought of it that way, but it is. It's sort of control. You can't behave, we'll help you behave. Here you go. This one, The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism, and Society, is excellent. And it's a series of essays by scholars on what the title describes. So these are just some of the books on the subject of transhumanism and posthumanism, which I think has replaced the humanities traditionally conceived that Lewis himself taught and presents, and his friend and fellow Inkling, J.R.R. Tolkien, also taught and represented in his life, and to some degree, if you want to see the science fiction and the bad guys in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, it is to some degree those who represent the Tao versus those who are transhumanists. And transhumanism inevitably ends in posthumanism, which is the extinction of all life. So they present it in fictive terms as a story. It's really, like all science fiction and all good fantasy, to my mind, a social commentary. And that's why, even though Tolkien's backdrop is an age thousands of years before human history ever happened, people read it as a contemporary social commentary. They recognize that it really is relevant to their lives. That's because I think it is. The critics don't like it. Why don't the critics like it? Because the critics are part of the conditioners in Lewis's transhumanist, they're part of the transhumanists. The critical tradition has followed it. So academia has been captured by these sorts. And Lewis and Tolkien are like dinosaurs in their midst. Says a fellow dinosaur. You thought they were all dead. Not yet. But in the third talk, by the way, he gave these lectures at the University of Durham, which was in Newcastle, up where I did my PhD. I found that encouraging as well. In 1943, the Riddle Memorial Lectures. And the third one, Lewis warns, that is in the Abolition of Man, Lewis warns that if any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of the power. Just like Frankenstein. If we have the power to create life, that person is no longer a human being of the same status as us. This is our patient. These will not be freer or better humans. They will be weaker, he says, not stronger. And I quote, "For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. They have no freedom. They're to use them in this way and not that way." And a good illustration of it, again, read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. He's describing something very similar. So using sophisticated biotechnology, now remember this is written in 1943, where eugenics is happening in Nazi Germany, but also in Britain, and also in Canada, and also in the United States. And it's being promoted from the pulpits in the name of eradicating the consequences of sin. So illnesses and inherited diseases, but also moral infirmities. So if you're a homosexual, you will also be experimented upon because you're a moral degenerate. So it's a species of moral enhancement. If you're a Jew, you're subhuman according to the Darwinian, social Darwinian views of the day. So again, you can be experimented upon. But the point here the point here about the Jews is the Jews are sort of a canary in the coal mine for what's going to happen to all of human beings. Because ultimately, if you can dehumanize the Jewish people, when actually, in terms of German society, the Jewish people are the most important in some ways socially. They're the scientists, they're the intellectuals, they're the musicians, they're the theologians. I mean, just if you look at they're the doctors, the lawyers, and they are in Canada to this day, by the way. If you can act upon those who are socially elite, then who will you not operate upon there? Comment or question, but I don't want to entertain too many today. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to comment that I was researching the death of Joseph Stalin, and he died from a brain hemorrhage. He had a stroke, and they didn't call any doctors because they had just done what they called the doctor's purge, which he had ordered, which is really around.
Oh, he purged the doctors, so there was no one to call.
Jewish doctors,
right.
Because he hated the Jewish people, and they didn't want to call any of them out of prison in case he actually came back.
And then he would have broken his...
Operating with...
Right, right. That's pretty funny.
So,
yeah, well,
so
it's a little bit of poetic justice there. Yeah, thanks for that. But he says, and these are famous quotations, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. That's what it effectively means. So the power over nature is not everyone's power over nature. It's the power of those who have the power to control nature. When we say nature, what do we mean? We mean human nature. Well, are they going to do these experiments on themselves? I say this on the day that Canada has introduced a great experiment on the Canadian people, legalization of marijuana. This is an experiment. It's a social experiment. It was on the CBC today, right on the website. Everybody knows the effect of cannabis on people, actually. It's not good. For some, it's very bad. It induces schizophrenia, about 10% of the populace. You want schizophrenia the rest of your life? You won't know, by the way, if you're susceptible to it until you try it. There's no legally recognized threshold at the moment of intoxication, so how are the police going to stop it? Or say you're intoxicated. Well, the courts will throw it out. Say, by what standard are they intoxicated? I mean, they have no bar. Well, that would just, and so on the one hand, you're not going to be able to prosecute anyone. On the other hand, the police are going to be able to pull anyone over because they might be intoxicated and give you the gears over it. So it enhances the power of the police state. I don't think this is necessarily intentional. It's probably an unintended consequence. It's a tax grab. It's the growth of the bureaucratic state. And note that it's the amount, I think it's like $8 a gram I heard on the radio this morning. That's way above what the street cost is. So it's not going to get rid of the problem of illegal marijuana anyway. It's going to make a few people who are well connected very rich because they'll invest in pot stocks. And the wealthy will be able to insulate themselves from the effects, and the poor people will suffer the consequences, and then we'll get addiction recovery clinics all over the place, and the government will be helping us from the problem which they allowed to begin with. But let me not get off topic again. But this experimentation on human beings is characteristic of the conditioners. And the reason it's characteristic of the conditioners is because they don't actually acknowledge that there is a human nature that is God created, or given even. It's a stuff, it's a malleable thing that they can experiment on. So it's the Frankenstein scenario. Now the final stage, and this is from, again, the Abolition of Man, the third of the essays, is come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, think about that. You can if you detect that the child has got some sort of disease or infirmity or weakness, you can operate in utero, or you can abort. But you can do this and by education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will have been won. It's happening as we speak. Eugenics, by the way, was condemned as a war crime at the end of the Second World War. A war crime, which the Nazis were accused of doing. But as I said, eugenics was going on all over the place, and it never stopped. We just don't call it eugenics anymore because it still has the unsavory connection with the Nazis. Do we really do eugenics? Well, what's eugenics? Well, it's making people better through breeding. That's Planned Parenthood. The purpose of Planned Parenthood is to get rid of the stock of human beings that are unfit to live. And Sanger's understanding of that, you can guess what it is. She puts them in the ghettos. Lewis is intensely suspicious of modern educational projects. To all moral relativism, which he thinks is in the educational establishment. And again, Danielson argues the same thing in his good book, by the way, on that front. He argues the exact same thing. Moral relativism is not only invited, it is actually taught in the schools. Whereas education ought to be the exact opposite, because real education is actually moral training. That's one of the reasons I came to this place, is because we had a lifestyle policy. Not that I like lifestyle policies, but it acknowledged that part of my vocation is to be a moral witness of some sort. I don't really like that in one sense, but in another sense, it acknowledges what I believe to be true, which is that it's impossible to act in a morally neutral fashion. Education is not a morally neutral endeavor. So that the myth of neutrality has to go. Education is either making you better people or it's making you worse people. The worst of all is the one that says it's neutral and it's anesthetizing you to both good and evil. So education historically is supposed to make you disgusted at certain behavior and make your hearts soar at other behavior like bravery, and make you feel disgusted at cowardice and betrayal and abuse of those who are weaker and so forth. Bullying, you're supposed to hate that, feel disgusted at it. There's still at least that sense there. I don't think the moral law can be eradicated, but it can be distorted and weakened. But Lewis is very concerned about the biotechnological experimentation that with humanity as the patient. The word patient means literally one who suffers, from the word from the Latin word to suffer, from which we also get the passion of the Christ, the suffering of the Christ. Christ suffers, a patient is suffering. We think of suffering as agonizing feelings. That's actually not literally correct. A patient is literally somebody who suffers the action of another. So we can talk about the passive voice in English. I hit you is the active voice. You are hit is the passive voice. You suffer the action of being hit. Right? So it's something that is done to you. So if we consider people, so if I consider you to be my patients rather than my pupils, then I will do things to you that I would never do to myself. I could consider that. I'm not constrained by the first do no harm. That is the law of the Tao. I can actually make you worse by false teaching. So I better do correct teaching. But either way, I'm under as Paul says, teachers are under a stricter rule for that reason. He's not just talking, by the way, about pastors. I think he's talking about educators in general. And then that includes parents, because parents are the first educators. Parents will be held more accountable for the behavior of their children, which is why they're given the prerogative of discipline. It's to lovingly correct the child and teach the child right and wrong. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. Ephesians 6, verses 3 and 4. See for yourself. But he's very concerned that humanity is being rendered all as patients, the objects of experiments, and they will suffer these experiments. They will have it happen to them as if they were not beings that had that were made in the image of God and whose freedom needed to be respected. Now, as I say, the social scientific method will ask you to sign a waiver that you're consenting to the experiment upon you. But that's just a formality. You're not really aware of the consequences of the experiment. And so in general, it's just, and also it usually seems pretty trivial, and that's because it is pretty trivial. Will you do this survey for me? And then we'll tabulate the results and we'll produce some sort of conclusion on the basis of it. But he's very concerned about it, and he explores it also in That Hideous Strength, which we just read. So in the Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, there's a very dark vision of the human race that has been brought into force by the NICE, National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. I like the title because it reveals the sinister nature of humanitarianism. Not that you can't be a humanitarian in one sense, but modern humanitarianism doesn't recognize the human integrity of individual people, at least not when it rejects the Tao. So the Tao is the centerpiece of this. He thinks that the moral law is the ethical restraint on this conditioning. And people that won't acknowledge the moral law, which he doesn't only talk about in the Abolition of Man, it's at the beginning of mere Christianity. He talks about it as the first step to understanding the Christian life is to acknowledge that there is a moral law to which we all already under which we already operate and acknowledge right from early childhood. We speak about that. Well, that's unfair. He got a bigger piece of cake than I did. But as he says, should this project succeed, every individual human being will suffer in his own body, in his own cells, a new nature crafted by technologists. And there's a lot of money to be made on trafficking human bodies, by the way. Always has been. Used to be called slavery. Now we can call it sex trafficking. But I would extend it, and Lewis would extend it to the establishment, the people that wear white lab coats, whom we respect and get paid by the government and are working for us, the taxpayers. They are also, to some degree, I'm not calling them human traffickers, but they are to some degree trafficking on human nature because they no longer recognize the Tao. Medical ethics, if you go into the medical profession right now, medical ethics might be one course that you might take, and it's probably not a very significant one. And that's in part because the latest and newest technologies, whether they're chemical or physical, some sort of mechanical implements like knee replacements or whatever, people want them, and it's big business. And big business, it works in conjunction with the political powers to advance human society. They see it as a partnership. If you want to see another aspect of this, look at the UN's Agenda 2030. Have a look at that, which is being implemented in Canada, by the way, without your knowledge or consent by the Liberal government. Agenda 2030. Have it up. Have a look. I'll provide a link for you next time if you want. UN agenda, have a look what it calls its agenda. One of it is mass immigration. One of them. The other is sex education and so forth. If this happens, the new human nature will mirror a moral vision founded on a popular but largely unexamined mythology like the myth of progress that I talked about from the beginning, or evolution. And the end effect will be, and this is Lewis's conclusion, and I think it's correct, the power of man to make himself what he pleases will be the power of some men to make other men what they please. The powerful. It's portrayed in Orwell's 1984, in Huxley's Brave New World, in Lewis's The Abolition of Man, and there are other books at the same time. So the bad guys aren't out there, they're sort of up there. And they don't even know what they're doing because they've abandoned the Tao. They don't actually, they're not morally responsible agents. They're in power, but they're not actually aware of the moral consequences of their own actions. Lewis portrays that in That Hideous Strength. Right? Those who are in the inner ring, they don't really get what they're doing. Some of them are there because they want to be insiders, but they don't really understand. They just want to be important. So there's the pride motivation. Others are a little bit more zealous, the Weston type characters. They think that they are advancing human freedom by, first of all, it's specifically human freedom, and then in Paralandra it becomes the freedom of all life. And what the freedom of all life means is the eradication of organic life in favor of spirituality. Right? That's the freedom. We're going to free you from organic matter. That's described by Strake in That Hideous Strength as well. He hates organic matter. We want to perfect it with artificial trees. This is post-humanism. So transhumanism, as I say, is the attempt to perfect human nature. Post-humanism thinks that human nature is an empty category. There is no such thing. And when you get rid of the Tao, then you have no such thing anymore. These man-molders of the New Age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state, the technological state that Jacques Ellul describes, and an irrepressible scientific technique. We shall get a race of conditioners who really can cut out all posterity in any shape they please. So we'll get rid of, through abortion, through euthanasia, some, and then the rest will be made better, enhanced. Now, those are just the scientists. Lewis sees that's the same project involved in the social sciences. He calls them conditioners. That's his label. He is contemptuous of modern education all over the place. You can read about it in Narnia as well. But scientists and bureaucrats at work on the new humanity, for them, values and emotions are mere physical phenomena or epiphenomena. Phenomena is an appearance, and an epiphenomena is something that arises from the appearance. So the feeling that I have consciousness is an epiphenomena for them. I'm not really conscious. I just think I am. Think of the Matrix. So the idea that I have a distinct human nature, distinct from you and from other people, and that I am subject to certain ethical constraints is fictitious. This is just epiphenomena. This is my genes and the chemical aspects of my body tricking me, deluding me into thinking that there are actually people, individuals outside of myself. Note that spirituality is always holistic and inclusive. It sounds great. What it does, though, is eradicate individuals to a sort of Borg-like existence. But if you used advanced psychology, you can repress these values and emotions to create the world that the conditioners want you to live in. So the battle takes place in the field of education. In order to do this, he says, so there's something that's extraordinarily unique about this. Because, again, when he goes to the Tao, chapter 2 of his book, he says that every nation throughout history, every major religion cries out against this technique. Remember I talked about the causes last class in the Aristotelian four causes? If you see human nature just as a formal cause or a material cause, then you can act upon it without any consideration of what it was meant for, who made mankind, and for what purpose. We can ignore all those things. We can just look at human nature as if it was just a lump of flesh, which is how you call it a fetus if you don't want it. Note that Harry and Meghan's are expecting a baby, not a fetus. It's the same lump of flesh that other people can abort, but they wouldn't do it in their case if they want it. We're all overjoyed at Harry and Meghan. They've got a baby. It is great. Why isn't it a fetus? It becomes a fetus when we want to get rid of it, because then we've dehumanized it through language. Right? Social control of language. If you want to read a good book on that, read George Orwell's The Politics of the English Language. Illustrated in 1984 as thought crime and so forth. Right? But when we break with the Tao and past traditions, values just become an educational outcome to be propagated rather than a deeply rooted moral awareness to be refined. So every child has this deeply rooted moral awareness. Babies instinctively, by their nature, moral nature as moral beings, when they see a bad thing happening, they get angry. If you've ever been around kids, you'll see this. They know when something's wrong. They get angry. That's good, actually. But if we think that anger is just a chemical or an epiphenomenological expression, we're going to seek to chemically and in terms of behaviorism eradicate anger. So anger or whatever needs to be get rid of. So people who get angry in public just need to be controlled. There's no such thing as righteous anger. It's just all bad. So he says that if this, when we break with the Tao and traditions, the values become an outcome, not something that is pre-existing. And then the values can be whatever we want them to be. Note that the public education system talks about the transmission of values, or Canadian values, doesn't define what they are. That's because it's a moving target. We'll tell you what it is after we've brought you there, and then we'll keep on moving. Do the same thing with the law, by the way. It's called the living tree model of jurisprudence. So we understand that past laws said that murder, first-degree murder, was a crime abhorrent to God, punished by capital punishment. Nowadays, we're more humane. We're not going to kill people for taking another person's life willfully, intentionally, in cold blood. Thereby, human life becomes of less value in the name of humanitarianism. So there's no just theory of punishment anymore. Rape is no longer even a crime. It's called a sex crime. It's not rape anymore. We don't use the word rape anymore. It's too strong. It's too visceral. When people hear rape, they say that's wrong. The law doesn't talk about rape anymore. It talks about a sex crime. And now a sex crime can just be innuendo. I felt offended by what that person said. I felt, what's the distinction then between rape and feeling offended at what someone said. It's just gradation. So seriously problematic, to my mind. And then somebody accused of such things can lose their livelihood in the same way that somebody who committed rape could be. I mean, there's a Supreme Court justice that's just gone through this sort of thing. Whatever you make of it, that's the politics of this around the language of it is potent. But the conditioners, so the values will now be the product, not the motive of education, whereas before it's the motive. The reason why it was the motive before is because the universe was inherently constructed by a God who in his nature is good. And so the universe bears his handiwork, all the marks of it. If you do this, it's going to harm the world, therefore you don't do it. It's wrong. Children ought not to strike their parents. Citizens ought not to revolt against their kings. It's called rebellion. There's such a thing as lawful authority. Men ought not to have sex with women who are not their wives, let alone children, let alone family members, and so forth, let alone animals or anything else. There's a clear, bright line. These are not allowed. And you'll find them, as I say, in every major religion, these same things understood. But if that is eradicated and values become the product, not the motive of education, then the conditioners will acquire the capacity to produce conscience. Because conscience before was an innate capacity to know right and wrong. Romans 1 talks about it, in fact, and says that it is true of all people. They're without excuse, because they know. But if the conditioners can produce conscience, then they will decide what kind of conscience they will produce. And you can find, you can come up with your own illustrations of this. But not that long ago, homosexuality was regarded as abhorrent. It was immoral. Now it's celebrated. Pedophilia was once regarded as something that every person would stand against. Now it's being encouraged. And the resistance to it as a moral objection is being, you can object to it on some sort of power imbalance. But then if you can get around, because you say, well, the reason why it's wrong is because this person is stronger than this person. Well, that's not the real reason. This person's mature and morally responsible. The child is yet to fully mature or develop the moral capacities to consent. But what happens if you teach consent to a 6-year-old? Which the sex ed curriculum does, by the way. It introduces the idea of consent. Consent is a moral category. It's not just yes and no. It's understanding the consequences. Do you think children understand the consequences of choosing to have sex in any way? I'm not even talking about specific acts. So I wrote against this in public, by the way. It was very unpopular, I will tell you.
Do you mean your National Post articles?
Among others. Yes. When I say it was unpopular, it was very popular with some, but unpopular in official circles, because it's the way the world's going, right? To some degree. I'd say there's a real tension there, but I mean that just goes with the territory. So suck it up. I'm not complaining about that. If you're going to speak out, you're going to get criticized. There you go. But he says that the conditioners, if they see values as the product of education, then they can make values whatever they want. They can produce it. Whereas if values are innate, then they can only acknowledge it, they can't produce it. And that limits their ability to change human nature, and they want that limit to go. Because there's money to be made in trafficking human nature. So he prophesies, and his prophecy is now proved to be true. Future academic and government elites will define good and then set about producing this invented good through education and biotechnology. And to say, the case made by Savalescu, who's at the University of Oxford, by the way, makes the case for moral enhancement, as well as education. The Common Core curriculum in the United States is part of the same agenda. Our syllabi have been rewritten in terms of outcomes. That's part of the same move. Yes?
Are you, right then we mentioned, were you saying that the United States education system has been updated?
I'm saying that the Common Core, that this is, read Danielson on this. So it's the updated version. It's the argument of C.S. Lewis. It's 3 chapters. He explicitly refers to the Common Core and how the language creates the sort of outcome that Lewis was concerned about. So it talks about creating values and so forth, but it doesn't suggest that there are any pre-existent values that we are to acknowledge. And thereby that, as I say, it's a moving target. The values are, well, whatever the government wants you to value, those become the values. And they might be in accordance with the Tao, or they may not be, and there's nothing to judge. See, this is the point. Once you no longer have a commonly, innately understood sense of right and wrong, and you just accept what right and wrong is based on what somebody in power says, you just need to get in government, and then you can change what is valuable. And what is human. And there is an element of naivete on the part of some educators. I'm quite sure of that. Because education is a very soft field in terms of academic rigor. And it may be in part because of the influence of the human sciences and so forth. We need to make clear, though, this is not an attack on science per se, it's an attack on scientism. It's a view of science, and it's a view of science connected with this transhumanist agenda. So science tells us what science is, and science is, again, what the scientists tell you is science. I'll get off topic if I talk about that too much. Comments or questions at this point? Okay, well, in the Abolition of Man, when he introduces the whole argument, so back to the first, when he talks about the way, he wants to distinguish the 2 types of education that he acknowledges, that he can really see, and they're quite clear. One of them, and he, as I say, he creates these fictitious names for the educators, Gaius and Titius, and introduces various analogies, like a Roman father teaching his son. He would not say to his son, "Do as I say." He would say, "Do as I do." Now, he might tell him, "Do as I say" as well, because you're under authority, but ultimately he would expect this. He would not do anything to his son that he wouldn't do himself. Because he loved his son, he wants his son to become like him, not to become unlike him. Because he would recognize that the son's moral nature, the essence of his being, is the same as his being. So it would be initiating children into a life of which the fathers and their forefathers also participated. So there would be an unbroken continuum of living a certain pattern of life. That would be the traditional view. So, and then he quotes the Latin maxim, "It is good and beautiful to die for your country." And then he questions that. I mean, he's writing it in 1943. Right in the middle of the Second World War. It's good and beautiful to die for your country. Well, is it? what would make it good? Well, it's good and beautiful to die for your country. Well, it seems to be, by Lewis and Tolkien's experience, a pretty horrific thing. War is awful. Modern warfare is inglorious, to put it mildly. People are blowing you up from miles away. They're gassing you. There's no more, you're facing your enemy, and the more virtuous of the two knights is going to conquer on the field of battle. There's none of that. Why should we believe that it's good and virtuous to die for your country? People will appeal to that while they send other people's children out to battle, but they're not going to send their own. Whereas the Roman general or the Roman father will believe this strongly because in his country there is something that he wants to protect. And sometimes war is a necessary evil to do precisely that, but it's not an unmitigated good. But think about how war is portrayed in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. They're not instigating the war. The war has been waged upon them, and they are defending everything that is good and beautiful. The hobbits don't even want to fight. They hate fighting. Same thing in Lewis's sci-fi trilogy. These are not people who are desiring the glory of military victory. They're fighting because they've been brought into a conflict, and unless they fight in whatever theater of war there is there, whether it's through the realm of ideas or spiritual war or just resistance and standing firm, as Ephesians 6 calls it, that's a necessary thing for the sake of everything that is good. But what if it's not so? What if that's just an epiphenomenon when we say it's good and beautiful, and we can debunk that? To say actually it's not. We may feel good about it, but it's not really good. Because there's no such thing as good and evil. Those are just words that we use to describe our feelings about it. So the whole of the first chapter, which is the first lecture, is discussing how in the language of our day, educators debunk the feelings that are connected with that essential aspect of our human nature, which relates to our passions. Or he calls it, he makes a reference to thumos, the spirited element in us, which makes us, as I say, feel disgusted at certain actions and feel elevated at others. So we prize courage. We revere those who are courageous, and we feel disgust at the coward. Yes?
Sorry, what was thumos again?
Thumos is the spirited element. So there are three aspects. This is Platonic ideas picked up in Aristotle as well. There's the rational. There are three parts of human nature. There's the rational element. There's the passions, and then there's the middle thing, the thumos, the chest, the heart. He's not referring to the blood pumping organism. He's also not. It's also not referring explicitly, although I think there's overlap with the Hebrew notion of lev, which is the heart, which is the innermost being. It's more the part of us that we connect with virtue. So that part of us that is going to be spring into action to protect what is good and to fight what is evil. That part of us, it needs to be trained. There's some people who are naturally more courageous than others. I think that's true. But courage can also be taught, and the chief way it's taught is by example. But he'll be training in virtue, and this is the understanding of education, by the way, which I ascribe to. Education is training in virtue. Training in wisdom and virtue. Which is why I said I wrote the National Post article, because it was sort of courageous, and I thought, So I had people actually, a group of pastors ask me, you know, aren't you afraid of the consequences? I think, what are you talking about? Why would I be afraid of that? I mean, I knew why they asked, because there's a social pressure not to speak out again. Yeah, well, of course there is. And I'm not so stupid that I don't recognize it. What I am saying to you is that you have a moral responsibility to do it, and if you do it as well as I do it, then there's no reason to be afraid. Because the people that are imposing this are actually cowards, and they're just using the force and the power of government to impose their will on people that are willing to go along with it, act like poultry. So don't do that. If you see that it's wrong, then say it's wrong. That's all you got to do. Exercise your freedom as individuals in this country to say, no, I'm not going to tolerate that. It's wicked.
They're terrific articles, Dr. Masson. Would you consider putting the links to them in my Tyndale classes?
I'm going to put them on my own personal website, which I've been working on for months and totally ineptly unable to pull it off. I'm also hoping to put some of these lectures up on there eventually. But I'm just so useless with technology, which is probably appropriate given what I'm talking about in the class. I'm just so useless I can't even manage to pull it off. It's not rocket science. Anyway. But yeah, eventually they'll go up there, and I guess I could put the links on our course webpage as well.
Please.
That would be easier.
Yes,
I can do that. Yeah. My own website? No, can't do it. Anyway. My colleagues in philosophy have been asking me to do this for years, and I've resisted it, but now I've broken down. No, I just can't do it. It's not that I'm not willing. But according to Lewis, the effect of this is to step outside the Tao, the moral nature, which is our own moral nature, and thereby to sever our humanity, to cut us off from our humanity. So he makes the comparison. As I say, the Roman father who said to his son, it's good and beautiful to die for your country, would have died for his country. The modern educator says it's good for you if you take this thing, but would never take it himself or herself. The analogy I'll give, gender ideology, all those are things that we ought to promote transgenderism. Why don't they do it themselves? Do it themselves. I want to see it. I want to see Justin Trudeau become a woman. Do it. Then I'll believe that you think it's a good thing. Go ahead. I want to see it. Right? If it's and if not, then what's your problem? Maybe you're part of the problem. Do you have a moral objection to this? Is there something morally wrong with it, or is there some physical problem with injecting yourself with hormones and having surgical alterations on yourself? Well, why not? Or do it to your wife, because she's all full-on progressive as well, right? No, but my point here is that the educators and the people would never do this themselves or to their children. They're going to resist it. Because they can see, because again, it's a view of education. It's something we do to other people who aren't people because we've dehumanized them by rejecting the idea of the moral law, and now they're just things, stuff, human bodies that can do, and we're allowing them the freedom to do. We're allowing them the freedom to choose it. But everyone knows because of social conditioning, bullying, peer pressure, that kids will want to be the opposite sex simply because it's the trendy or cool thing to do. Or they'll get a free pass on it and people won't be able to criticize them. They'll be able to rebel in that way, and it's a social phenomenon. Now, I can tell you that when I've spoken on this, parents come up to me afterwards and they say, I am terrified for my kids. And there are more private schools that have started up in the last year than in any year previous, by the way, in Ontario. And I'm sure it's the case all over the place because these same things, they're afraid now. People are, and rightly so, I would say. I think there are other reasons to have concerns about the public education system, but this one is like it's the sort of the line that's gone too far for some. But when you do this, you not only are doing something to someone else that you would never do to yourself. So you are actually defying, even Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, will have something like a Christian notion of doing unto others as you would have done unto themselves. So you don't do anything to another person that you wouldn't wish a universal maxim, says Kant. So you have to recognize that that is a moral being, and there's a limitation on that, on your own action then. But if you won't acknowledge this, you cut off your moral connection to all of human nature. And when I say all of human nature, I don't even mean the contemporary world. You cut off yourself from the past. You regard your forebears, your parents, your grandparents, Jesus Christ, and the church throughout history as having no common ground with you. You can't learn from them. I've described this repeatedly in my lectures as the model of the orphan, which we see in literature from the 19th century onward. Regard yourself as being an orphan, having no natural parents, no natural connection to anyone, and therefore no natural law or moral law upon you. You discover for yourself what the right thing to do is. You can see it all the way up to Harry Potter and Spider-Man and whatever. All the superheroes. They're going to determine, because of their superpowers, what the right thing to do is. Whereas the father would be introducing his son or daughter into a way of life that they themselves had lived, and they could say without any reservation, this is a good thing to do. You should do this. Follow my example. Note that Jesus says, follow me. You do what he does. We have the bracelets. What would Jesus do? We regard there as a moral example by Jesus. It's not the atonement. We're not following. We don't have to die on the cross like him, although we could. But we are to do as he has done. The Apostle Paul says, do as I do. And he leads us by example. That's the age-old pattern of discipleship, mentoring. It's the older generation teaching the younger generation by example. Modern education, on the other hand, speaks of kids as orphans and tells them, how do you feel? And what do you think you should do? And the kid goes, I have no idea, that's why. Even at university. The classroom is not a venue for me to flip the classroom around and ask you what you think and feel about the subject. Not that I don't care what you think and feel about the subject. I actually do. That's why I ask you to write essays. But I start off by saying, here is what I think about it and here's why I think it. And follow my track with my thoughts on the subject and consider whether you think it's correct or whether I'm missing something. I'm open to the thought, by the way. Different pedagogy. So it's different pedagogy, different aims, different outcome, different regarding for the students. You are not my patients. I might be Dr. Masson, but I'm not that sort of doctor. Right? And nobody would ever think otherwise. But so the modern educator, the conditioner, as Lewis calls them, regards his pupils as poultry. It's like a poultry farmer with poultry. We're going to do something to you that I would never do to myself, and at the end of it, at the end of the experiment, maybe I'll eat you. Nobody's eating people yet. Though the idea is already nascent in Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. So the view of human nature as something that we're outside of and not subject to the moral law, has been thought. The consequences have been around since the early 18th century. But now the humanities have been shifted, so that's the explicit aim. Lewis's essay, his inaugural lecture when he was installed as the professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, it's called De Descriptione Temporum, on the description of the ages, talks about the 19th century as the mid 19th century as the pivot in which we no longer understand ourselves according to the moral law as everyone throughout history did, whether they were pagan or Christian. And now we look at human nature as a thing that we can experiment on. He sees it right in the middle of the 19th century. And he doesn't say exactly when or connect it with a person, but sometime in the mid 19th century there's this shift. And he's one of the old school. He thinks that there is no real education worthy of the name that will not acknowledge our connection with our illustrious forebears. Which is why we continue to study them. That we think they have something to say. I think C.S. Lewis has something to say, which is why I teach C.S. Lewis and not what Scott Masson thinks about the world. I teach what C.S. Lewis thinks, or what J.R.R. Tolkien, or what John Milton, or what the Bible says. I think it's more important than what I have to say. You will agree, I hope. Genuinely. This is not false humility. That's what I'm doing. We're teaching texts. In my classes, we read the text. We comment on the text. That's because it's more important than what I have to say, I think. So that he talks about that there, and how we can just through just little bits of language, like, well, when we talk about our feelings, they'll say it's only a feeling or it's merely a feeling. And every student will understand that what the only or the merely means, which is that it's not true. But he says if it's true that our feelings about things are not true, then we've rejected the Tao. Because throughout human history, our feelings about things have always been regarded as having truth content. Remember, there's a distinction between our reason, our thumos, or the spirited element of us, and our passions, our feelings. But our feelings are guided by our reason, but particularly by our notion of right and wrong, which Lewis calls the Tao. And we know it innately. We know it when a big kid is beating up on a little kid that it's wrong. We don't need to be taught that. It's wrong. We get angry. Good. You should get angry. In fact, that is to be encouraged, because that's the spirited element, that is that feeling of anger is going to cause you to intervene. When somebody's drowning in the water, I'm going to say, and I don't know this person. Let's say this person is, I don't know, from another culture and so forth. I'm anxious about them. Like if you're a woman that's a Muslim man in the pool, you think that this is a misogynist culture, but he's drowning in the pool, and you're there, and you're thinking, I could save that guy because I can swim, and he can't. And so part of you is going to say, I don't want to jump in the pool because he might drown me. And furthermore, he's a misogynist anyway. The guy hates me. And so you're going to be rationalizing why you don't want to help the guy out in the water. And it's a strong feeling. I don't want to help the guy. I'm going to turn away from it. And then there's part of you who says, that's wrong. That part of you is the moral law speaking in you. It's weaker, by the way. The feeling of not wanting to do it is stronger than the feeling that you ought to do it. But that doesn't mean the feeling that you ought to do it is wrong. On the contrary, it's right, and it needs to be encouraged. So you need to strengthen the right feelings. And what lies behind that? That is your neighbor. You're to love your neighbor as yourself. That's moral teaching. That needs to be strengthened. That's the purpose of education, and it's education by example. So you would expect parents who want to teach their kids to be good citizens to be good citizens themselves, and they're going to follow your example. I find it a terrifying thing, by the way. My kids sit in my car when I'm driving around the city of Toronto. They hear me griping and grumbling, and I'm like, and then I hear my son in the back seat saying words that I've said, and I'm like, oh no. Calling his sister idiot and stuff like that. I don't know, no. Could be worse. Has been on occasions. Gosh, yeah, I have a captive audience in the back. You forgot about them, yeah. Oh. They're learning by that, right? So there's a thing, you can say this, but what does mom and dad do in that situation? That's because that's what they're going to do. Very powerful. And either you are strengthening what is already latent, the Tao, or you're fighting against it, and modern conditioning is. So then he describes the Tao, and the reason he describes it in chapter 2 is then to demonstrate in chapter 3 how the modern collusion of the scientists and the educators is acting against the Tao, and they're going to do it in order to experiment on people. And they are, in fact, doing it in his day, and they continue to do it, which is why this is as relevant as it ever was. In fact, it's more relevant, because now it's not the Nazis, the bad guys, that are doing it. It's the good guys, because there are no bad guys anymore, because that's how far the attack on the Tao has extended. There are no more bad guys. We don't want to call other countries, nations wicked, right? We're going to promote it. So we don't talk about it in terms of morally or good or evil. That's just not the language. And so there's this phenomenon called globalism. And then you get the Donald Trumps of the world. People voting for a man that I think many people find objectionable on certain levels, but they think actually he's fighting against the globalists. So if he's on that side, maybe I'm on his side.